Hey everybody. As an initial note to this review, it's important to recognize that my first immediate response to the series was about as negative as most anyone else's, and this review reflects that. But it's also important to note that Mindy Kaling didn't create this series, nor is she credited as a writer for at least the first 2 episodes, so my review may overestimate her involvement in the development of the series. I wanted to say this briefly because a major complaint is that this is a vanity project for Kaling, but the truth is that we can't be sure just how involved she was in the social commentary or the story of the series. What we can say is that it didn't deter her from taking on the project, but that's about as close as we can get. I want to be as fair as possible to those I've criticized, and to be as honest as possible not only about my opinion of the series, but also toward the facts of the target. That's all I have. Now on to the review. Velma. Boy, it is seriously taking a pounding from critics and audiences alike. Mindy Kaling took to Twitter to thank the viewership, which was the, quote, biggest premiere for a Max original animated series ever. But while a whole bunch of people watched it, a whole bunch of people really did not enjoy it. That's a Rotten Tomatoes score of 55% from critics and a bellowing 7% from audiences. Why is this happening? Well, here's my initial take, and I'll follow it up by breaking down the reasons I, and many others, felt that Velma is a snarky, bitter self-insert for Kaling, who seems to think of herself as an iconoclast by deconstructing a dried-up well of pop culture that the internet had already exhausted in the decades prior to this jumbled, lazily written vanity project. The characters are tired modern stereotypes and, as many people have pointed out, painfully unlikable. They're petty, cruel, and narcissistic, with the exception of Norval, who fans of the IP will recognize as the legal name of Shaggy. The backstory and mystery we're introduced to are jumbled and senseless. The writers really seem to be more interested in using the more proper craft elements of storytelling as a rickety vessel to deliver an onslaught of social commentary and kitschy pop culture quips. Okay, so how does it actually do all of this? Let's start with a recap of the story. A popular girl is murdered at Crystal Cove High School. Velma and Daphne discover her in a locker with her brain missing. There's a little exposition on Velma's home life during which she discovers that her father's girlfriend, an analog of an Instagram model, has purchased an expensive new camera. Daphne's two mothers are both cops in Crystal Cove on the case to solve the mystery. Velma is reluctant to solve this mystery because of her tragic backstory, in which her attempts to solve mysteries as a child drove her mother away for reasons unclear, to put it kindly. Velma has vivid and terrifying hallucinations due to the trauma of feeling responsible for her mother's disappearance, and so she doesn't want to attempt to solve this mystery. She's sort of vowed it off. No more mystery solving. But when Velma's brought in for questioning, she's told that she'll be arrested in 24 hours if she doesn't clear her name, and so she's strong-armed into trying to solve this mystery. Most of the plot of the mystery is expositionally revealed in a car ride conversation with Norval, who has Brenda, the first victim and popular girl, and a reporter on Norval's high school newspaper team, use his camera to spy on the local owner of the town Hotspot, a malt shop run by Sophie, who you'll remember as Velma's father's girlfriend. But all Brenda reports back is that she saw something strange in the bathroom, and she has photographs. Norval suspects that Sophie is running a drug operation out of the malt shop, and that Sophie stole the camera from Brenda after murdering her in order to keep the photos from being made public. More on the origins of this absurd suspicion later. But that's misdirection, of course, and as it turns out, the camera that Velma saw Sophie using earlier is legitimately hers and not Norval's, and that her secret is that she's just letting teens have sex in the bathroom. So where's the real camera? Well, during an encounter with Daphne and her popular girl entourage in the ladies' room at high school, Daphne reveals that Fred is so self-conscious about his body that he forces everyone out of the restroom at the malt shop when he has to go. A weirdly specific and unrealistic detail, I know, but that's the plot we're dealing with. This strikes an epiphany with Velma, who immediately believes that Brenda took photos of Fred while he was in the toilet, and that Fred must have killed Brenda to keep the photos from leaking. So she and Norval break into Fred's house, where she does find Norval's camera, but it turns out Fred stole the camera and paid off Brenda to keep photos of his hairless legs from being leaked because he, get this, is a late bloomer and still hasn't finished puberty. Of course, he gets shot in both legs by Daphne's cop moms before this is revealed, and now we're back at square one on the mystery of who's killing the popular girls and stealing their brains. So that's the story, but what about all this stuff everyone's complaining about? All the disgust registered over the show, and all the piss-poor reviews. Okay, let's start with the thing everybody started talking about prior to the series airing, the race swapping. Many people are asking why Velma's black in this series, but that's not actually the case. She's South Asian. She's of Indian descent, like Kaling herself. Some might see this as a point for the accusation of it being a vanity project. Daphne is a highly sexualized half-Asian, which she's sure to note in the opening sequence in conjunction with one of the episode's many arbitrary monologues of social commentary. Daphne is also the adopted daughter of a mixed-race lesbian detective couple. Norval is black and nerdy, simultaneously a nervous wet blanket and also willing to zip off to break into someone's house at the drop of a hat, presumably to impress Velma, upon whom he has a crush. Fred is an attractive, white-privileged, popular guy, who even Velma fawns after, if only to get a piece of his ascot, but he's characterized as a narcissistic idiot who can never remember Velma's name because
I have a disease where I can't recognize people who aren't hot.
And finally, as many have brought up in their concerns and bafflement over the series, there is no Scooby-Doo. At the New York Comic-Con, Velma's showrunner, Charlie Grandy, stated that, quote, "We didn't want to just kind of take these beloved characters and put them in outrageous or gross situations and say, isn't it crazy you did that to Velma?" He also said, quote, "We couldn't get a take on it that was like, how do we kind of do this in a fun, modern way that felt like what made it a kid's show was Scooby-Doo." Of course, many outlets have also been sure to note that the series was not permitted to use the character of Scooby-Doo by Warner Brothers. Maybe they didn't want to sully the dog's name with the raunchy adult series, or maybe they saw the writing on the wall with what the writers and showrunner intended for the show. Either way, I think it's safe to say that general ire over the series would likely have been even more intense had the titular Great Dane made an appearance. So is there anything specifically wrong with race-swapping the characters? This is a question brought up by Velma herself. Well, it depends on who you ask. Some say it's a progressive effort to drive inclusion into a pop culture burdened with an excess of white maleness, which is a piece of social commentary highlighted at the beginning of the episode in the opening monologue intended to sell you on the progressive efforts of this series before we even get a glimpse of Velma herself. She has this to say.
Sure. Normally, origin stories are about tall, handsome guys struggling with the burden of being handed even more power.
Others argue that POC washing previously white characters is an insult to people of color because it inherently assumes that they can't draw a crowd on original character merit alone. This isn't a video about race swapping, but I do think it's useful to note that in an interview with People magazine, Kaling said, "I think of the characters in this as so iconic, but in no way is the gang defined by their whiteness. Except for Fred." It leaves us wondering what exactly she means by this, and why. In this iteration of the IP, Fred is the only primary character who is wholly white. All the other characters are of another race or they're mixed. And Fred's primary conflict is a poor relationship with his father, who we never meet, but who is apparently ashamed of his son's general weakness of masculinity and of his status as a late bloomer. We only ever see his father in photographs, where he's depicted as a pro-gun man's man, who one could easily imagine quoting Nietzsche by way of Jordan Peterson. In short, Fred's a secretly sensitive guy who's been burdened with the toxic masculinity which he inherited from his father. Given that Velma's character has a bit of a thing for Fred, I think it might be safe to say that what we can expect from this character in the future is that she is going to save him from his toxic masculinity in some way or another. But what does any of this have to do with Fred being white? We aren't really sure, and it isn't really even apparent in the episode other than Velma saying this.
If I were a rich white dude, I'd kill everybody just to get away with it.
Given Kaling's comment, we're sort of left to assume that she sees his character flaws as part and parcel of whiteness itself, which, if you've come to believe the rhetoric of books like White Fragility, may seem so obvious as to be self-evident. But let's not harp too long on this point, since there's a whole lot more to critique. One of the complaints I levied against the series earlier is that it's a narcissistic self-insert for Kaling. Let's break that down and see if that's a fair assessment. In an interview with People magazine, when asked her reaction to the complaints of race swapping, Kaling said this, quote, "I was a little bit surprised, and I think most Indian American girls, when they see this skeptical, hard-working kind of underappreciated character, can identify with her." We'll talk about this quote compared to the actual characterization a little bit later. One Collider article said, quote, "Kaling revealed growing up she always identified with Velma," further explaining, "She was so cute, but not like traditionally hot. Super smart, super thick glasses, questionable haircut. I just love the series, and I feel so honored to do the voice." At minimum, we can say that Kaling had every intention of modeling this character after her personal experience of being the same sort of person she believed Velma to be. She views herself as not traditionally hot, as super smart, apparently a bit nerdy, and maybe a bit fashion unconscious, at least in her teenage years. And so this Velma essentially is Kaling. It's Kaling sort of doing an animated cosplay of Velma, and while the creative staff behind the story development may say this is an homage to the original character, it becomes apparent to the audience that this isn't the case due to another major complaint being levied against the series. These characters in no way resemble their original versions. Among the many responses littering the internet about Velma, one you'll often come across is the complaint that these iterations aren't even a shadow of their beloved IP's original cast, and that they're horribly and deeply unlikable. Earlier, I quoted Kaling as characterizing Velma as a skeptical, hard-working, kind of underappreciated character. Except the writers don't seem to know the difference between skepticism and cynicism. She isn't skeptical, she's judgmental and overtly critical, and it comes from a place of bitterness over her lot in life. In the first episode alone, Velma is often left to monologue about her bitterness and resentment toward pretty much everyone else, as though she deserves to be treated better than she treats other people, including poor Norval. She says she'd kill everyone if she were a rich white guy just to get away with it. She harbors revenge fantasies so often that in high school she was dubbed most revengey. That's what the series says. In the opening scene, she starts a fight in the women's locker room for reasons that aren't really explained. Chalk it up to a plot that ought not be questioned for the sake of social commentary, which is the entire breadth of the opening shower scene in the ladies' locker room. It has no other purpose than to function as a vehicle for the writer's opinions on this or that. This is a problem we'll talk about later, and which you'll find burdens the overwhelming majority of the writing. Commenters will often mention that one of the beloved things about the original series is that the characters were kind and supportive of one another. Nothing could be further from these new characterizations. They're constantly cruel and antagonistic toward each other for every petty reason imaginable. No one seems to enjoy the company of anyone else, except that Norval has a crush on Velma, who literally laughs at him as he's expressing his adoration for her. She demands that he tells her more specifics of his adoration because it makes her laugh, and her laughter makes the hallucinations go away. Fred is a massive douche who looks down on Velma in every scene except the one where he can capitalize on being her savior as he dubiously explains to the student body that he's come to realize that Velma isn't just some weirdo, but a scared little boy who wants their friendship. He then smiles pridefully as Velma scoffs from the floor, having been pelted by literal garbage. Daphne accuses Velma of murdering Brenda at Brenda's funeral. She complains that Fred won't give up the dick even after a year of dating, and insinuates that this makes him useless to the point that Velma can have him. Velma, upon hearing that Fred hasn't slept with Daphne, quips that maybe he's gay. So, in this progressive pile of kitschy dialogue, we have an instance where even our, quote, skeptical, hard-working, underappreciated protagonist proposes that a high school guy who won't put out must be gay. Of course, as it turns out, he's not gay. It's that he hasn't finished puberty. Because, of course, the writers need to ensure that the rich white guy is as secretly pathetic as they can possibly manage. We ought to loathe him as much as they do, and they have the power to ensure that we do. But, to be fair, we end up loathing everyone else too. Velma herself is an absolute machine of judgment and cynical criticism. What Kaling calls skeptical is profoundly confused in this characterization with insufferable cynicism and bitterness. This is someone who pats herself on the back for her quips and feels she's earned her miserable attitude because she's smarter than everyone else and has a troubled backstory. Norval's the only character with any sympathetic qualities, and he's the target of the cruelest dialogue, from Velma herself. As I mentioned, she laughs until she apparently literally pees herself at his cringy expression of adoration for her. You want me to believe that she's smart and yet somehow really doesn't see his authenticity in this? I'm not buying that. She's awful and he deserves better. Finally, the tone of these characterizations is made pretty clear in the very beginning of the episode, in that initial monologue where Velma is absolutely sure to note that this is her origin story, and that
It was me, not Fred and his weird sex fan. This is my story, told my way.
not the rich white guy we all inherently hate, not the group as a whole with any collective desire for justice or the adventure of mystery solving, but solely our quirky, quippy, clever, keenly critical Velma Kaling.
And it starts with a murder, bitch.
But what about the actual story? If you put all that aside, is there at least a good mystery? Is the story fun and interesting? Well, the consensus seems to be that if you can put aside the frequent and belabored monologues of social commentary, and if you can forgive these characters their lack of any perceivable connection to the icons that inspired them, then no, the story is boring, flat, and lazy. So let's break that down. It's a problem of story versus social commentary. It's a problem of balance. This is where the complaint of the self-indulgence of the writers comes in. From the start, we get a self-indulgent monologue in which Velma denies that anyone else had anything to do with the inception of the mystery-solving gang. It wasn't enough to deny Fred any credit, but she has to go several steps further and claim that literally none of the other characters deserve credit for it. It was her. All her. All this hard-working, underappreciated high school girl whose mother abandoned her and who lives in a garbage town full of bigots and idiots where her talents and wit are clearly wasted. So insofar as this is part of the story, it immediately sets us at odds with the protagonist. She's selfish, pretentious, judgmental, and quippy. The opening scene is a sexually gratuitous naked fight in the high school girls' locker room, where a gaggle of pretty popular girls, including Daphne, are spouting meta-dialogue about how series pilots always have more sexual content than other episodes of the series in order to hook people in. Well, this series consciously does exactly that, and that's the joke. But there's no story here. It's all the writers peacocking their clever meta-dialogue, like insufferable Reddit commenters making sure everyone knows how keenly they can break down entertainment media and judging anyone who sees it differently. Now, the irony of this criticism isn't lost on me, so don't worry, but I do think it's worth noting the general consensus, the breadth and specificity of this critique, and what I hope is a comparative lack of social arrogance. And of course, whether or not the critical evaluation has legitimacy to it, beyond showing off quippy critical writing. I'll also point out that in this scene, one of the characters says she loves the overt sexuality trope, and that in today's overcrowded market, you need a hook. Apparently, in an overcrowded market that too often uses sex to sell a pilot, the reasonable hook is using sex to sell the pilot. This is the point that sparks a physical rumble with Daphne, ending in Velma creeping up and assaulting Daphne herself. We never know why she decided to insert herself into this argument apropos of nothing and uninvited, but it may be a foreshadowing of the character's role in the commentary of the series overall, to insert herself into social conflicts and give us the answer we all actually need to hear from the smartest character on the show. As a final note, this conflict ends for the most part when Velma asks Daphne what she thinks of race swapping, and Daphne gives precisely the answer the writers probably gave on some Twitter comment, to which Velma actually says,
yes. I wasn't expecting such an enlightened answer from such
a bitch.
The commentary also very often centers around Velma's bitterness about her lot in life. At any given time, if you pause this episode on Velma, she's angry or bitter about something. This is her face pretty much throughout the episode. Add to this that everyone, including her father and his girlfriend, tell Velma that she's a murder suspect because she's a creepy weirdo, and that the solution to this problem is to fall in line with the normal kids and hang out at the mall or the malt shop. We've heard this time and time again. Our protagonist is a misunderstood iconoclast who has to fight the normies to retain her individuality and impart some lesson upon the world about the merits of being different. Except she really isn't any different from those kids. She's judgmental, combative, and arrogant. The only difference is that she isn't traditionally attractive. And this is the crux of the whole plight of Velma that we keep coming back to in the character commentary. When they find Brenda's body in a locker at the end of the shower scene, Velma quips that Brenda only climbed in her locker to prove how skinny she is. We'll note more as we trudge through the story. From Velma we get, why does everyone else suck so much? As she assaults other girls, judges literally everyone around her pretty harshly, and acts confused when the world doesn't open up to her. And we're supposed to feel sympathetic for this character. But what we're left with is indifference. She's just as unlikable as everyone else, so we don't really care if she's treated the way she treats other people. Then there's the interrogation scene. In the beginning, we get a quip where Velma expresses she has a right to a phone call and, quote, a handsome detective she infuriates with her indifference. Once the detectives arrive, she fires another quip that God's not real if you two morons are running this investigation. I'm not even really sure what that quip is supposed to mean. There really isn't a joke in there, except that it's sort of delivered as if there were. It comes off as a forced insert to get that little atheistic comment in, like a nod to the viewers who share their overarching snark about society in general. This kind of forced quippy dialogue burdens the whole episode. When the detectives tell Velma that she's a suspect in Brenda's murder, we get yet another quip, in this relatively short scene, where Velma says the only good stereotype of lesbians is that they're great at solving crimes. Then the two detectives fire off a series of insults as they guess at why Velma would want to shower alone. They poke at her weight, her, quote, handsome face, and her, quote, hairy gorilla arm. More on the plight of Velma's lot in life. Velma's quick to correct them and explains that she hates Daphne and her fake-ass friends. This is because, as it's revealed, Daphne and Velma were the closest of friends until Daphne got popular, morphed into a mean girl, and became Velma's excuse to bitterly judge the world. So in all the quipping, we start to get a little bit of story, but it doesn't hold out for long as we find out that when the writers sideline their monologues and quips to address actual plot, it starts to get a little stupid. The detectives demand that Velma help them solve this crime in 24 hours or she'll be arrested, not because they think she actually did it, but because they admit to being terrible detectives and require Velma's genius to solve the crime. So our plot point here is that two grown women, two detectives, are demanding that a high school student who is suspected of murder not only go out to clear her own name, but actively help them solve the crime of which she's suspected. That's our plot. She's suspected of a murder and has an arbitrary 24 hours to solve the case or she'll be arrested. So let's really take a closer look at the story behind all the commentary and see if there's something of merit. We'll start with Velma's backstory. Velma has vivid and terrifying hallucinations because of the trauma of her mother's disappearance, and because it was Velma's incessant mystery solving as a child that drove her mother away, or so Velma believes. So we get a flashback where we see Velma's memory of her mother. Her mother was a mystery writer who drank and smoked, but in this first flashback we see her as a loving mother who gives her daughter little mysteries to solve. But then Velma gets older and, quote, bolder, and she goes off to solve her own mysteries. Bolder apparently meaning that she discovered her Christmas presents early one year, and was absolutely devastated that she ruined Christmas. This is the gravity of the flashback, honestly. Velma found her Christmas presents and thought she ruined Christmas. But her mom loved her so much that she went out and bought her something special. Her mother's van is found abandoned with a wrapped gift inside. When Velma discovers this, she decides to start wearing her mother's glasses, which I guess is supposed to be a heartwarming connection between the two, but literally anyone watching is wondering about the fact that they're prescription glasses. You can't just pop them on and live in relative blindness. This doesn't work. To the point of almost insulting itself as a moment of heart. I'll also note that she finds the gift and never opens it, which means that the investigators never opened it. At the scene of a disappearance, there's an unopened gift-wrapped box, and they never think to open it, nor does Velma or her father. But this is only the first flashback. Later, her father tells her, and has apparently told her this before, that her mother didn't leave because Velma solved a mystery, she just left. And Velma says that's impossible because that would mean her mother didn't love them. But then she has a second flashback where she completely re-envisions those same moments from the first flashback flashback, except her actions as a child are torturous to her mother, gouging out her eye, getting wasted on her mom's booze, coloring all over her mother's writing pages, and busting her laptop. So what's happening in all this? Velma is an unreliable narrator. She's unable to honestly review her memories of her mother. In the first flashback, she's sweet and they're all positive. In the second, they're different to the point of absurdity. She goes from having these sweet memories to seeing the wild and grotesque darkness of them without any real journey or character development. They suddenly reveal themselves to her in a completely different light, apropos of nothing. And what about the catalyst for Velma's hallucinations? We're to believe that it was because her mother disappeared or left them, that Velma blamed herself, apparently because she was an accident-prone child who found her Christmas presents one year. And that's if the worst is to be believed from what story we're given. This is supposed to make us sympathetic toward her, but nothing in Velma's backstory is significant enough to justify her generally cruel and judgmental nature. In fact, it's flimsy and sophomoric. We're asked to believe that the trauma of her mother's disappearance, caused by her daughter's cartoonishly accidental terrorizing, and the tragedy of finding Christmas presents early, led to reality-bending hallucinations from which Velma's only escape are grounding exercises and laughing at her only friend pouring his heart out about how much he adores her. There's exaggeration in animated storytelling, but then there's absurd plotting to the point of nonsense, and I think a lot of people caught on to this and were pretty quickly bored with what little the show had to offer in terms of story. This kind of thing doesn't get any better either, as we see with the actual plot of the mystery itself. But what about the rest of the story, right? The mystery of the murders, the A-plot. Most of the A-plot is expositionally revealed in the car ride with Norval, as I mentioned earlier. Norval suspects that the malt shop is running some kind of drug-dealing operation. His reason? Because it's weird that a malt shop is the most popular place in town, for teenagers, so it must be drugs that's attracting the youth to the hotspot. Velma, in all her apparent genius, entertains this dopey suspicion, and that's what passes for a lead in this mystery. She goes on yet another monologue of social commentary, justifying Norval's suspicion on the grounds that in pop culture, it's always a racially stereotyped malt shop owner with folksy wisdom. And Sophie has no folksy wisdom, and is just a, quote, basic bitch who doesn't know how to use hashtags. And so pop culture reasoning dictates that there must be some nefarious reason that kids like the malt shop. Velma then makes the connection that Sophie had bought a brand new camera, and that this must have been the camera she stole from Brenda after killing her to keep the drug thing under wraps. She gets excited at the prospect of solving the murder, but more excited about sending Sophie to jail. And so we get that bitterness over Sophie's superficial attractiveness proving to be more important than the more noble pursuit of justice. Another reason this character is deeply unlikable and difficult to feel sympathy for. It's revealed that Sophie's camera is her camera, and that the secret of the malt shop is that she lets teens have sex in the restroom. That's it. That's the misdirection. So Velma's back to square one. Later, in an argument with Daphne in the girls' restroom, Daphne reveals that Fred is so self-conscious about his own body that he forces everyone out of the restroom. Not everywhere, but she specifically notes that this happens at the malt shop. This weirdly specific and poorly written moment of epiphany has Velma immediately suspicious that Fred killed Brenda because the weird thing she saw in the malt shop restroom must have been Fred's hairless legs or something. It isn't clear how she would have gotten such pictures unless Fred dropped his pants all the way down at the urinal or left the door open in the stall, but hey, this is the quality of writing we're dealing with. Would it have been less belabored and made more sense if Fred was found cheating on Daphne in that sex bathroom? Yeah, probably, but that would rob the writers of the opportunity to make the rich white guy as literally unbelievably pathetic as possible. Even when Norval questions this as an unlikely motivation for outright murder, Velma justifies her suspicion by saying,
If I were a rich white dude, I'd kill everybody just to get away with it.
and that's all we're expected to go on. It's all that justifies this investigation. So they decide to break into Fred's house where, as mentioned before, they find Norval's camera, discover Fred's actual reason for stealing it, what he actually did, that he isn't the murderer, and we're back to square one on plot A by way of another lazy misdirection. By the way, Velma isn't arrested for breaking and entering, presumably because, she's been asked by the detectives themselves to solve the mystery. So she presumably gets carte blanche to do whatever she wants in pursuit of solving the murder she's suspected of committing. Somewhere in all this, by the way, there's also a scene in which Velma decides she's going to stop feeling guilty about her mother's disappearance, that she left because she, quote, hated Velma and her father, and her solution is to take Sophie's advice and court the popular crowd by dressing in more revealing clothes and pretending to be, in her own disingenuous words, a, quote, normal, well-adjusted teen. Something she's absolutely hated from the beginning of the episode, something we can't imagine she'd allowed herself to become for any reason through the seething resentment of the fakeness it represents. But here we are. It happens, and Fred gets a little nod to white saviorism as he proudly permits Velma into the world of popular kids, and really only for the virtue-signaling reputational benefits it affords him. We know this because Velma scoffs and basically drops that whole arc immediately, effectively making it a pointless scene inserted specifically to make a vague point about white saviorism. They don't believe her anyway and literally throw garbage and a paper cutter at her. Nothing really comes from it, although Fred's speech strikes a chord and the school applauds, welcoming Velma into I don't know exactly, some vague sense of normal social interaction or maybe general respect. It isn't clear and it doesn't really become relevant any later in the episode. Okay, so what have we established in all this? We've broken down why the characters are profoundly unlikable. We've established that the social commentary is most of the writing, and that it sidelines a story that has lazy, senseless plotting, and that this show, overall, has nothing positive to add to the IP that supposedly inspired it. Mindy Kaling said, quote, "I think of the characters in this as so iconic." Charlie Grandy said that they, quote, "didn't want to just kind of take these beloved characters and put them in outrageous or gross situations and say, isn't it crazy that you did that to Velma?" So if they had so much reverence for the original IP and its beloved characters, why did they feel the need to edit them to the point that nothing of the original remained except, ironically, the vague semblance of their superficial designs? If Kaling and Grandy adored and respected these characters so much, where is any sign of what they revered? There's nothing of these characters' original concept here. They've been hollowed out and reconstituted as vessels for the social commentary of self-indulgent writers who crafted the plot points of a mystery on the dubious prejudiced judgments of a mean-spirited cynic who was begged by detective to solve a murder that she was suspected of committing. In the end, there's nothing truly redeeming or skillful about the writing of Velma. The visual designs and animation are relatively strong compared to other adult animated series, but that's the only grace in a series otherwise burdened and overstuffed with the kind of toxic rhetoric you'd be accosted with if you stepped down the wrong alley of Twitter. There's been a lot of talk about the show, and as I watched that first episode, I found much of the critical reception was justified. It in no way felt like an homage to the beloved IP that supposedly inspired it. The characters were insufferably toxic, the plot was superficial and senselessly constructed, and the writers couldn't bear to stray from the progressive system of tired modern stereotypes. The series often feels like a writer whining about being made fun of in high school, and it plays out like a revenge fantasy, where the suspected murderer is literally stealing the brains of pretty popular girls, who are all absolutely stereotypically terrible. So how does it feel to watch the show? What's the final analysis? It's a half-cocked, rapid-fire insult fest full of deeply unlikable characters built up as overwrought modern stereotypes with exhaustingly flat backstories by self-indulgent writers, peacocking itself as hyper-relevant to an audience that can immediately recognize a series standing on brand recognition alone, using legacy characters as tools to get back at people the writers probably argued with on Twitter, who seem to be using this IP as a cathartic middle finger to the pretty people that made fun of them in high school. I think Velma sums it up succinctly, although maybe to her chagrin, when she cries, "I'm weird and no one likes me." Velma, it's not that you're weird. You're not weird. You're just the same as the people you hate, and you prove it throughout the episode. We're never given a single instance of your weirdness. Instead, we're shown moment after moment of you judging everything around you as harshly as you can manage through a furrowed brow, while simultaneously whining about how cruel and judgmental the world has been toward you. We don't care about you. We weren't given a good reason to. You were violated by writers with intent beyond what made you lovable, and they ravaged you toward their own ends. Many people feel that this was a shame and a major loss for the character. I agree with them. Now, this has only been a review of the first episode, but I didn't want this review to go on for too long, so I'll briefly address what changes in episode 2, how it compares to episode 1, and some quick counter-arguments to my critique up to this point. First, the major complaint of Velma and the others being terribly unlikable starts to be addressed. Velma's judgmental nature, quippiness, and rudeness actually simultaneously get both worse and better. Worse in that the writing is significantly worse, but better in that she concedes to Daphne's accusation of her poor attitude, and also admits to being wrong, though it gets much worse before it gets any better. But that said, pretty much every other point of complaint in my review of episode 1 gets much worse in episode 2. The writing gets quippier, cringier, and the plotting gets far more lazy, jumbled, and absurd. I won't break it down as I've broken down episode 1, I'll let you discover that for yourself. With Velma's notable character development by the end of episode 2, however, it's conceivable that the points I've made about Velma's aggressively progressive and judgmental commentary will be whittled down in the same regard as her poor attitude. But later she admits to being wrong about Fred, so it may be that the show also intends to address the unreasonable racial commentary, but that remains to be seen, especially with how the Fred issue plays out by the end of the second episode. With Velma's character development being addressed, I'll also note that this may vindicate Kaling's description of Velma as a skeptical, hard-working, underappreciated character, if she learns to actually be those things by way of better writing. The quick final note I'll make is that we do meet Fred's father in episode 2, but he's everything you'd expect him to be. That's all I've got for you, and that concludes my first video review. These do take quite a while since I'm the only person on staff here, but thanks for sticking around to the end, and hopefully I'll see you in a future review. Long live Story. Good night.